Okay, we're going to get started. First, I want to send a huge thank you and shout out to DJB Diamond for our dance breaks. I don't know about any of you if you had a chance to go have a break with DJB Diamond, but she sure does know how to energize and rock us out. And so we're excited to have her again tomorrow during our break. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janelle Mercado. I'm the Assistant Director for the Supporting Innovative Practices Project. I have short, straight blonde hair, hazel eyes, glasses, and I'm smiling at you all while I'm doing my best to look like I have everything under control at this point in the day. No, it's been such an incredible day. I'm wearing a light blue shirt and sitting in front of a SIP virtual background, fully aligned with the SIP branding and aesthetics. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. We are honored to learn from our day one closing keynote, Valissa Thompson. Valissa Thompson is a licensed master social worker, LMSW, nationally recognized disability rights consultant, writer, and activist whose work centers and uplifts the experiences of Black disabled people. As the founder and CEO of Ramp Your Voice, she's built a powerful platform dedicated to self advocacy, empowerment, and authentic representation. Her expertise has been sought across major media outlets, from The Today Show to NPR, Teen Vogue, and the New York Times, where she brings sharp insight to the intersectionality of disability, race, and culture. She also contributed her leadership to national policy conversations, serving as a consultant to Senator Elizabeth Warren's 2020 presidential campaign. A visionary creative, Valissa established one of the first conferences created by and for Black disabled people, carving out space where their voices, talents, and truths take center stage. Everything she does revolves around being unapologetically herself, Black, disabled, and making good trouble to shake up the status quo. She's our kind of gal. During the SIP presentation, feel free to share your questions and comments in the chat and through the Q&A feature. We have a member of our team, Juliet Yanyanwu, who will be monitoring the chat and collecting your questions for our live Q&A. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Valissa.
Thank you so much, Janelle. Can you hear me okay?
We hear you great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. I feel so privileged to share space. I hope that everybody's been having a good first day of the conference. From what I've heard, it has been amazing. I am Valissa Thompson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm from South Carolina. And before I start, I want to give a visual description of myself. For access purposes, I'm a light-skinned Black woman who is sitting in her wheelchair. Even though I know you really can't see the wheelchair, it's here. I have on glasses, a berry colored lip. My dark brown hair is pulled back into a ponytail. I have on a very decorative shirt that is shades of purple, white, and red. Well, a little bit magenta pink. And I'm wearing hoop earrings that you may or may not be able to see. Have on a nose ring, and I have on a very bright, sunny yellow background because we're on Zoom and sometimes we need a little cheer in our day. I am very happy to share space with you all. This is a workshop where I share a little bit about myself and my experiences growing up as a disabled young person who is now not so young, but still young at heart. And the differences I've seen with this generation of young people, the Generation Z and Generation Alpha, versus myself being a millennial, and what we can do as the adults, of this time to support our young people, particularly our disabled young people who are multiply marginalized within their disability status, their race, their gender, um, sexual identity, immigration status, and so forth. So I am going to get started by sharing my screen so we can dive in. Okay, I'm going to minimize things so I can see. All right. So our closing keynote is titled The Radical Act of Belonging, Discovering Your Place in the World as a Disabled Person. So this is my origin story. And I'm going to start off by what it was like growing up disabled in the 1990s, going into the 2000s. And honestly, when I was preparing for today and I really thought about the idea of belonging, I realized how very lucky I was to felt that from my micro community. When I say micro, I mean my family, my teachers, my neighbors. And I say luck because in doing this activism work, it'll be 13 years this summer, I met disabled folks from all parts, different parts of this country, the world, who did not have that micro community support, where they really did feel isolated and ostracized for being disabled, along with any other identities they may have. And so, in thinking about this time period of being lucky, it made me realize, wow, it shouldn't feel that way. It shouldn't be that way. Every child should feel valued and supported by his, her, or their community. And it shouldn't have to be something that only a privileged few, based on luck of who they're around or who they're supporting, really embrace who they are. And to feel that sense of luckiness of sorts helped to counter the messaging I received as a young girl, teenage girl, and young woman of that era. Because for those of us who do remember the 90s and 2000s, it was not the greatest time for people who were different, particularly different in ways in which society wasn't used to, quote unquote, or just wasn't comfortable with. And for me, when I think about that era, I think about the disability representation that I saw, or really the lack thereof. You know, these generations of disabled young people today, they get so many, different disability representation in their books, in their media. And that was not a luxury I experienced at that time, to where disability representation was very siloed. It was very medical model based due to charities that was trying to support disabled people. We all, if we are of a certain age, remember that very famous telethon that would happen every year by a particular actor would host. Um, the representation wasn't about the empowering of disabled people. It was more so about, look at these poor disabled people. Can you believe that they live like this? Why would somebody feel so much joy in being disabled? Excuse me. And when I think about that messaging, it's very disempowering. It's very negative. It's not helpful. And it did nothing to move the needle in understanding disability outside of the medical model approach. Also, of the 90s and 2000s, I think about the language. People were still using the R words in some capacity, particularly in our media when it comes to comedy and such. It wasn't, it was becoming to be frowned upon, but it was still in some circles acceptable. We were using a little bit outdated language like handicapped and so forth like that. Our language had not progressed to where we are right now, and people declaring and claiming the word disabled. So our language was a little behind in how we talked about things. And also going back to that medical model approach, we emphasize the defect, quote unquote, of the person instead of seeing their disability as a part of their identity, just as their racial identity, just as their gender identity, their sexual orientation. It was very separate from the person. And that was intentional in how we looked at disability at that time. Also, the visibility of disabled people um, wasn't as robust as it is now. And also that visibility includes diversity of disabled people. When you think of a disabled person, typically a white disabled man comes to mind. So at that time, the lack of visibility of disabled people, particularly diversity of the community, was missing. And also for me, within particularly the Black culture, there was also a level of invisibility as well. Even though the 90s and 2000s had this, in some way, renaissance of Black media and Black influence of that time, disability, Blackness and disability was not being connected in that way. So even though in one aspect of my identity, I felt seen in media, in um, in what I read, and so forth like that, the part of my disability, that part of my identity was still missing. And so even though I felt seen in one sense, there was another part of me that was still being unfed. And thankfully, going to college particularly allowed me to see other disabled people with all types of backgrounds. It was the first time I met someone with my particular disability, which is a rare disability. And that was a really good feeling of being seen. Also, I also found disabled people post college and grad school, particularly with us using the internet and social media more intentionally to make connections beyond our borders, both stateside and nationally. And that really helped me see that some of the things I was dealing with as a young person at that time wasn't unique to me. And that made me feel less isolating, particularly as someone who knew that my employment journey would have to be different than my able-bodied and non-disabled peers. It was nice to meet other disabled people who understood that as well and who were carving out their own um, career path. And so it made me not feel as alone in that journey. And also because of the internet, I was able to do more things online, which was way more accessible for me than other means. And in 2013, I developed Ramp Your Voice, where I was able to talk about my experiences as a Black disabled woman and social worker, and really making the connection between social work and disability in ways that I didn't see, in ways I did not get in my program, which was a great program, but it was still some of those pieces were missing. The way we talked about disability, and there was a lot more that I learned about being disabled, particularly the history aspect of things that I did not get in college or grad school. So developing rapid voice was my awakening as a disabled person in understanding disability beyond just the medical aspect of things, understanding that there's a social model of disability, understanding that disability has a culture, has a pride, has, you know, communities within the community. And that brings me to the last point of building community. That was my way of engaging with other Black disabled people since intersectionality, even though I know is not a popular reality in this climate, but intersectionality doesn't matter and be able to find people who can relate to you, who understand those nuances. And in build a community, as what you heard from the intro given by um, uh, Janelle, I created the Rapid Voice Conference, as a way for us to be intentional about covering the diversity of the community, which is very important because my experience as a Black disabled woman is different than my white peers, different than my um, Asian peers, and so forth. And also, it's good to have spaces to where it's for people that look like you. It's a thing of like the for us by us, the FUBU model. And so, shameless plug, in the next month, we'll be doing the second Ramp Your Voice where we have an incredible lineup. So, if you want to um, join us, you can. It's a free event because I don't want finances to be a barrier for anyone to engage. And that's very important to me to make my events accessible, not just in make sure I have ASL and captioners, but also make sure that anybody who wants to engage can. So, in finding my voice as a young adult, these experiences are those that I am grateful for. But I wish I had them much younger. Being of the age I am now, which I am a part of the elder millennial cohort, it makes me wonder, would my sense of belonging have been stronger if I had felt this at the age of 5, 10 years old, 15? This pondering is why belonging has to be present for all children, especially those who must be marginalized. So I know you probably heard different facets of belonging throughout today, but I want to kind of bring in belonging with connected disability, and you'll see what I say as we spend time together here. But what does it mean to belong? I'm going to provide two definitions of that. The first definition is from the Mind 24/7 team that came out in February of 2024. It states, a sense of belonging is the feeling of being accepted, valued, safe, and included in your family and community. It is the feeling that you are an important member of something bigger than yourself, whether it's a family, classroom, or friend group. When it comes to our second definition, which is by WCGB from June of 2024. This is one of two parts of it. At its core, belonging is in a diverse community involves a sense of acceptance and inclusion. This acceptance extends beyond superficial attributes to encompass a deep respect for different cultural traditions, languages, beliefs, and lifestyles. It means acknowledging and appreciating the richness that diversity brings, rather than viewing it as a challenge or a barrier. When community members feel accepted, they are more likely to engage, contribute, and invest in the community's well-being. I chose these two definitions of belonging because they had the through line of acceptance and inclusion. And those two words for me feel like they bump against particularly the heavy anti-DEI culture of today. Belonging counters that rhetoric because it knows that in order for us to really be a successful society, everyone has to feel like they are a participant in it, a welcome participant within it. You cannot say that your place is belonging to people if you're nitpicking which people are being accepted. And I want to go back to this first definition, the feeling of being accepted, valued, safe, and included. All of those things matter when we're talking about children and young adults. We cannot have successful classrooms, successful community, or successful world if the people, particularly those under 25, do not have or feel those four things: accepted, valued, safe, and included. What does it mean for young people to feel like they belong? Well, belonging impacts their sense of self-worth. I know for me, in my micro community, I knew that I had value. I was respected by my teachers and my family. People cared about my well-being. And in that reception of those things, I understood that, hey, I have a place here. People care about how I feel. People care about if I'm okay. People care about my success, socially and academically. And that built my confidence up in how I showed up in my schoolwork, in my relationships with others, which we'll get to later down the list. Having that sense of self-worth did so much for me because when I got messaging outside of my micro community, that wasn't welcoming or felt safe. I knew that was not the truth. So the sense of self-worth is invaluable for children to have when it comes to belonging, a sense of happiness. meaning that I could be myself. I can be free. I can be quirky. I can be, nerdy as I wanted to be, which I was a very quirky and nerdy kid. I was supported in my interests, whether it was my love for Power Rangers to, my love for reading and writing. That showed up in my classrooms when my teachers realized I wanted to write. I loved writing. They supported that, which is why I became a writer today and working on, several books right now to bring to life. Because that sense of self-worth spills into the happiness of being content with myself. Even if I didn't have the visibility in the media, I knew that I was still worthy. How to make relationships with others. I understood that if I had support at home and in the classroom, then I can make friends. I knew that there were people who would respect who I am in my totality and not in the boxes that they were most comfortable with. A strong sense of knowing that their community, whether family, friends, school, and community supports them. That's so important, particularly for our kids who may be very different when it comes to their presentation, that may not conform to certain ideals. Having the strength of have that strong sense of knowing that regardless of what the outside messages are, when they come home, when they're in their school, when they're in their community group, they're safe, they're seen, they're loved for who they are, tremendous. And also their ability to grow and learn. Having all these elements allowed them to explore, to be able to make mistakes, know they'll be supported, know that they'll be comforted. All those things matter in children's development. And also understanding that they can give that to others as well. Have that curiosity about the world, a healthy curiosity, and not feel ashamed for asking 1,001 questions like kids usually do or young people do. And knowing that even if they're uncomfortable with asking something, the people around them will make sure they don't feel that way. That's what it means for kids and young adults to feel like they belong. And we see it's not just the words of that, it's also the actions. A lot of this is action oriented in showing kids that you belong here. And when I say the young people, well, who am I talking about? Well, we're not going to go deep into the generational differences, but I want to cover who is a part of this group because as a millennial, I know we get blamed for everything. But I do want those to know that we are not the young people anymore. Most millennials are in our 30s and 40s. So when you talk about the 20 somethings, you're really talking about Gen Z. Generation Z, better known as Gen Z or the Zoomers, they were born roughly between 1997 to 2012, and they are roughly between the ages of 14 to 29 years old. So they are slowly becoming not as young by the end of this decade when it comes to the older end of that grouping. And then we have Generation Alpha, who are the youngins of of this group of this generation. They're better known as Gen Alpha. Now there's some overlap here when it comes to when they start. Some people say 2012, some people say 2013, 2014. I'm keeping it simple, saying 2012 to 2024. And they are roughly between the ages of 2 to 14 years old. So we see we have our late teens, well, mid to late teens to the 20s for Gen Z, and we have our toddlers to our middle school age kids when it comes to Gen Alpha. So, what are the challenges disabled youth face today to belong? And when I say disabled youth, I do include all of our youth here, but I know we're going to spotlight disabled youth here for particularly the first three of these points. In the times that we are living in, the cuts and threats to accessible education services and supports, cuts and threats to healthcare services and supports, views about disability that may feel isolating. We'll see an example of that when we come to the current and historical views of disabilities in a second. family strain due to rising cost of living. And I would also add to that the fact that we have not engaged with the grief and loss of the pandemic. People talk about the learning loss of our kids, but we do not talk about the grief and loss of them losing people who died over the pandemic, particularly the first 2 years of it, and what that has done for kids who may may now be down to one parent or no parents or had to live with other relatives and are trying to process their grief while dealing with adults who are processing their grief and may not always be the supportive ones in talking about about those things. So the family strain that these two generations face is profound. Employment concerns, post high school, college, etc. If you are on the job market for anything, you know that the job market is horrendous right now. It is very hard for anyone to get a job, much less if you are a young person who's starting off with little to no experience. So their concerns about things is very real. And also wartime. I know that as a millennial, when I graduated high school, we were in the throes of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So I understood what I felt during that time and wondering about my friends who had joined the military, those I knew who had joined the military, wondering about the safety of the country. Also learning about some of the rhetoric of that time when it comes to religion and people's ways of life. There are a lot of things that come when you're coming of age, that come up when you're coming of age during wartime. So this is their unique experience as well. And also a unique challenge that Gen Z and Gen Alpha have is being chronically aligned. This impacts them knowing all of the world and yet journeying to find their own place within it. It's an interesting reality for them. It's very different from how millennials like myself used the internet when we were teenagers and young adults versus them. You know, Gen Z are known as the digital natives since they were being introduced to technology when they were coming of age, when Gen Alpha, technology is all they know. I'm putting my social worker hat on here, and I am going to be very curious what the research says, because it's already research, but what the research says that we take seriously, in the next 20, 30 years about how being technology, um, tech savvy, has impact on young people. We know there are cognitive realities here in a developing brain being constantly exposed to, messaging and media. But I'm very interested in seeing the socialization of these two generations when it comes to technology and how as they become the adults, in their 20s and 30s, how do they see the impact of being online? I know they're talking about it now, but definitely curious to see if the ways we think about technology today would be different in 20, 30 years. So we have an idea of what belonging is, what it does to a growing young person, and our two young people generation groups of today's time and what they're facing that's unique for them. I want to connect that uniqueness as into the historic and the current when we talk about the messaging that these groups are receiving. Because remember, they're chronically online. So that means that they are going to be getting messaging constantly about everything, whether they care about it or not, whether it's politically correct or not, whether it's factually correct or not in the days of AI and deep fakes. What is our societal messaging about disability? What is it currently? And how is it reaching back into the past? So connecting the current to the present. So the next two slides will show headlines from news sources and other research places about how disability and disability related programs or lifelines that disabled people use are being talked about. So we have the first one being RFK Jr. draws backlash for ripping Medicaid programs that pay people to care for relatives. Because Medicaid is a lifeline for many disabled people. And that means that it's a lifeline for many of our young people whose families rely on it. And we see that any significant cuts to Medicaid means that that lifeline is no longer a strength for those who utilizes it. Trump's Alexia Barbs, which was towards California Governor Gavin Newsom, stirs anguish and anger, perpetuated a myth about the learning disability. That was from WRAL News in April. Medicaid cuts could force more kids to become caregivers, which is a recent Time magazine article in April. It kind of goes back into that thing that I talked about, that family strain. You know, our kids, because of the pandemic, because of family shifting family dynamics and realities, some of them already having to step up and be the adults in their family to earn money to take care of things. So that's something to keep in mind. From National Partnership for Women and Families, states that new data shows unemployment rising for Black and Asian disabled workers amid Trump's attacks. But that goes back to the employment piece of we already know that disabled people are already unemployed and underemployed when compared to their non-disabled counterparts. So if you're seeing a rising unemployment rate for racially marginalized disabled people, then that's something that our young people who are about to graduate high school or college, or just wanting to change careers, or they're still in high school, want to get their first job, may be aware of. And our last um, news article here from First Focus on Children is a fact sheet, how eliminated the Department of Education threatens students with disabilities. So this means that the entire educational experience for disabled children could be changed entirely with the possible shifting of the Department of Education and special education element, special education and or accessible education, whatever wording you use, you know, if that department or that sub-department is moved or transferred somewhere else or is significantly reduced, the quality of education, the ability to go to school, the realities for disabled students within these generations would be drastically different than their predecessors, like myself. So we see these headlinings here of the messaging in our current day. And these are all headlines taken from this year. Then I even have to go back into 2025 or earlier for that. You may be thinking about, listen, how does this relate to the past? It relates to the past because A, America does not do a great job of learning from its past. And B, ableism, which is the social prejudice against disabled people, is as American as baseball and apple pie. And I say that because there are very few things in America that does not have a through line that connects back to slavery. And that is true to ableism and in disability and how we view disabled people and our bodies and our mere existence. It was not until I became a part of this work that I started to learn about the experiences of disabled enslaved people under the institution of chattel slavery. And at this time, I learned that roughly enslaved disabled people were placed into one of two categories. The first being they're useless. If you cannot produce labor, you had no value on the plantation by your enslaver. That does not mean you do not have value within your community. It means that the person who owned you couldn't use you in the ways in which they were using everybody else. But that second bucket, for some enslavers, they found a way to exploit their disabled slave by putting them into exhibits, and at that time, better known as freak shows. There are several stories of disabled enslaved people who were auctioned off in these, grotesque um, institutions to have their disability exploited for profit. In learning this, the through line of productivity, value, deservingness has always been a part of the American way in being able to distinguish between people who are worthy and unworthy, deserving and undeserving. And it connects to the idea of if you're not producing labor, you have nothing else to give to society. That connects to how we look at things today when we talk about work requirements, work programs for disabled people, the lack of funding or the resistance to fund, disabled people who may not be able to work for a variety of reasons, and them relying on the government to care for them because the government should care for its most vulnerable people, and the resistance of this government to do so well. I am somebody who was on Social Security for most of my life until the last decade. I know the hoops of having to do paperwork for Social Security, having to prove that I'm still disabled, even though I've been disabled since I was in the uterus, but still having to prove that I am worthy of getting this measly amount of money every month because at that time I couldn't work. Our dismissal of disabled people when it comes to devaluing them is very American. It's what we have done since the true creation of this country 250 years ago. And if we're not talking about the worthiness of someone because of their labor to produce, we are talking about their mere existence in society. That is where the ugly laws come into play. And the ugly laws were born in the post-Civil War Bay Area and were intended to keep the following persons from public view: diseased, maimed, mutilated, and any way deformed, so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object. The idea of disabled people being in a community and being seen by community is very new. Ugly laws, the last of the ugly laws were not dismissed until the 1970s. So it's really not that long ago that ugly laws were on the books, literally. And it shows the devaluing of disabled people from just being seen in our society. We also think about the historical and legal realities of what it means to be disabled in this country. As we see from the Buck versus Bell case that happened almost a century ago in 1927. The U.S. Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell set a legal precedent that states may sterilize inmates of public institutions. On May 2nd, 1927, in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ordered that Carrie Buck, and I'm going to use the language of this time. We know that we should not be using the following words I'm going to say, but I want to be true to the historical relevance of this case. Carrie Buck, whom it called a feeble-minded daughter of a feeble-minded mother, and herself the mother of a feeble-minded child, be sterilized under the 1924 Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act. So what do we have here? We have the United States government saying that they get to decide who gets to reproduce, who gets to have autonomy over their body. Sounds pretty familiar of our current time. Controlling disabled bodies has always been important to this country. Because again, it goes back to what? Slavery, goes back to what? The ugly laws. As I said, we do not learn from the past. We unfortunately repeat it in different ways, but it always shows up in that through line. And our last connection of historical messaging is eugenics. Early supporters of eugenics believed people inherited mental illness, criminal tendencies, and even poverty, and that these conditions could be bred out of the gene pool. Eugenics was popular in America during much of the first half of the 20th century, yet it earned its negative association mainly from Adolf Hitler's obsessive attempts to create a superior Aryan race. Eugenics has not left the building, people. It is just softer. It has more malleable language, like creating, you know, ideal babies using technology, curing certain disabilities by testing out the gene pool, the DNA of embryos. All those things are still eugenics. It just, we just don't be as blatant with it as it used to be. But what does the idea of eugenics mean? It means that people don't want you here. People think that your existence is a mistake, and mistakes must be corrected. That being disabled is a mistake and must be corrected. We think about the historical messaging here from enslavement, ugly laws, controlling people's bodies, stating who should be at all, are messaging that we still have in society and that our young people are catching in the way that we talk about things. And that goes into how we are failing young people. We're not being honest about how uncertain so many things feel and are in today's society, particularly when it comes to their rights, their disability rights, their reproductive rights, their immigration status rights, and so forth. And we're not honest because we had our own questioning and concerns under the guise of seeming capable of handling everything. We are not. And that superhuman, super adult reality make kids who are worried feel like their worry is kind of silly. It's okay to let kids know that some things are scary because they need to know some things are outright scary and they're not the only ones that are scared. That vulnerability has to be there when we're talking to our youth, particularly our youth, like disabled youth, who are not just worried about their disability status, but there may be other realities that they are facing. We're also not good at listening to the young people, and that is a complaint for every generation, right? Because I know us millennials, we thought the older people didn't listen to us, and now the young people are complaining about us not listening to them. It happens with every generation. But I think that we do have to take it seriously because these two generations are facing things that are vastly different than what we did. Listening to them has to be a priority. And also, the last point here, forgetting that their world and the world we grew up in are vastly and totally different and struggling to adjust, both on our end and their end. Because in some ways, we're struggling to understand what they're going through, and they're struggling to understand what we went through. So we are what, as the folks would say, two ships passing in the night. And sometimes we have to listen. And listening isn't about correcting, it's about holding space for all those uncomfortable emotions that they may have and you may have. But that's how we're failing disabled youth. And as the adults in the room, it is our responsibility to correct that. And we'll get to that at the end as to how we can show up. But I just want to kind of point out a couple of things that I've seen conversations about the young people are having. So we have covered the first half of this is about the realities that young people are facing and so forth, the historical relevance of things that's happening in the world, how they connect to the past. How can we connect belonging to disability and, and intentionally and better understand our disabled young people? We have to understand that belonging inherently upholds the framework known as disability justice. And if that's new to you, I will give you a quick crash course of what that is. The term disability justice was coined in 2005 from conversations between disabled queer women of color activists, the late Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, and the late Stacey Milburn, and later included Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. And here is basically a summary of why disability justice matters and why it exists. Disability justice was built because the disability rights movement and disability studies do not inherently centralize the needs and experiences of folks experiencing intersectional oppression, such as disabled people of color, immigrants with disabilities, queers with disabilities, trans and gender nonconforming people with disabilities, people with disabilities who are houseless, people with disabilities who are incarcerated, people with disabilities who have had their ancestral land stolen, amongst others. So Sins and Valid uh, has developed the 10 principles of disability justice. We're only going to cover three that I thought best fit the idea of belonging. But the 10 are intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalistic politic, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. So when we look at recognizing wholeness, what it states here is that people have inherent worth outside of commodity, relations, and capitalistic notions of productivity. Each person is full of history and life experience. So basically, this is saying that we are more and beyond the labor that we can produce for a very individualistic and capitalistic society. And that we have value and full of experience that overshines anything that we could produce for someone else financial gains. When it comes to cross disability solidarity, we honor the insights and participation of all of our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberations. So again, we understand that people have what self-worth, the sense of self-worth that we mentioned earlier, and that it really is y'all means all. And our last principle that we'll cover is collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only moving together can we accomplish the revolution we require. So basically, we're not leaving anybody behind just because they may not look like us. They may not believe in the same things as us. Their status, their multiple statuses they can hold is different than ours. And if we want a very successful, intentional society, together is the way to be. So in looking at those three principles and what they embody, it goes back to the whole idea of belonging, because belonging is about creating spaces in our society where every person's humanity is recognized and celebrated. Because we see it here, no body or mind can be left behind. We see it here. We honor the insights and participation of all of our community members. And here, people have inherent worth outside of commodity relations, and capitalistic notions of productivity. We have to see the humanness in every human. That is our collective responsibility, which calls for us to keep expanding our intention to acknowledge and respect the dignity and humanity of all people on this planet. Doesn't mean select group of people, doesn't mean privileged group of people. It means all of us. In seeing that belonging connects to disability justice, now we're going to see how belonging is a radical act for disabled people, because it is, particularly for generations of this time who are under 50. Millennials like myself, and our younger cohorts, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. Why belonging is radical. This is covered by the Othering and Belonging Institute at Berkeley University. And it states belonging means ensuring that everyone has the right to contribute to and demand change within the political, social, and cultural systems that shape our world. It is a vision for radically inclusive society where mutual power, access, and opportunity exist for all. So that alone embodies what? The three principles of disability justice cover, right? Recognize the wholeness, having solidarity with each other, and collective liberation. We cannot get to the other side of what we're seeking for when it comes to fighting for rights and justice if we're not thinking about everybody. Everybody has to be considered. Everybody has to be thought of. That everybody has an equal stake in what's happening. That's where that mutual power comes into play. Everyone should have access to the things that matter. Healthcare, education, opportunities, safety, and opportunity to exist at all and not have your existence seem burdensome. So what does being radical mean? Because a lot of people like to throw that word out, and they usually throw it out when your views do not match theirs. And that is not the accurate definition of what radical means. Radical goes to the root by identifying a problem and then obliterates it and starts from scratch or leaves it all behind. The most important thing to remember about what it truly means to be radical is that it is transformative, not subtle or minor. You can't just be a little radical. Radical is truly you either all in or you're not. If we want to go to a root of a problem, let's say ableism is our problem, and it is a problem, but we're going to use it here. That means we have to go to the root of it. That means that we have to identify the people who are ableist in our society, who are perpetuating ideas that are harmful. They're doing things that are harmful. We have to talk about the disadvantages that people have because of ableism when it comes to accessing certain things. But think about the systems and policies in place that create that division, that allow ableism to thrive and prevent people from accessing what they need. And we have to figure out how to eliminate that in order to create a new world to where ableism doesn't exist. That's what it means to be radical. It's truly shaking the table, not just shaking the table, but shaking it so much that it breaks. Why is belonging a radical act for disabled people? The current generation of disabled people under 50, millennials like myself, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, have only known a world where disabled people have been socially and politically included in society. Remember, we go back to that historical meeting of eugenics and reproductive autonomy, ugly laws, how disabled people were thought of during enslavement. Being socially and politically included is new. It's new for America. That understanding is why the younger generations are seeking radical acceptance of who we are, individually and in society. In making this slide, it reminded me of what my grandmother would tell me. I'm from South Carolina, still here. My grandmother grew up in rural South Carolina, of, the Great Depression era. And she would tell me that children like you didn't go to school. And I didn't understand what that fully meant until getting older and started to learn about access to things. My grandmother knew that a kid in a wheelchair could not go to school in the ways in which she did. She had to walk to school, like many Southern Black folks. She had to walk to school every day, miles at a time. I could not imagine having to roll myself to and from a school every day just to learn. Many disabled folks were in the back rooms, hidden off, not getting educated at all. It makes me wonder how many brilliant minds, how many talented people we just let be hidden because of lack of access, the ignorance when it came to think about disabled people. My grandmother's knowledge of that reality, I do believe, strongly influenced her, ensuring that I had the education, the educational experience that I did, supportive teachers, going off to college, pursuing a career that I wanted. Because she took that knowledge of her understanding of the world from her time period and saw what was possible for me in my time period. That's important for us to reflect on. That goes back into that intergenerational understanding of what makes us different in our respective upbringing and the values that those experiences have when we talk to each other. And I think that's why so many of our parents and grandparents and great grandparents of that age, who's older than us, who understand the way that the world works and doesn't work for people who are disabled, those that get it have a passion to ensure that us living in this time have the things that they knew we should have had all along. People of their age group should have had all along. And that brings us to here, having access to education, healthcare, diverse communities, online and offline, employment opportunities, traditional and self-employment are newfound realities for current day disabled people in the United States. Those of us here understand that such access was not the norm in this country and isn't the norm outside of our borders, particularly of our comrades of the global South and even of the West. There are people who are still fighting to be included in their schools and gaining health care in the UK, in Canada, and so forth, particularly when they don't even have the laws like we have here with IDEA, with Section 504, with the ADA. They are finding and fighting for their own rights within their own countries and borders. Disabled people, especially those under 30, the disabled youth, are aware that these newfound realities aren't to be taken for granted. The current rolling back of our inclusion and belonging is happening. And the youth are speaking out on social media about their concerns and pride in being disabled. And yes, there is a pride in being disabled because we have known everything but that. And that in itself is radical. Because somebody can think, how could you be prideful of being disabled? How could I not be? Your understanding of disability is very small, very heavily influenced by the ableist teachings, the messagings of our society. Pride isn't an egotistical thing. It is a reality of knowing that how I am is right for me. And there's nothing wrong with that. Disability has a culture, has cultures within cultures. It has a history. And when you dig into that history, you can't feel anything else but pride in knowing that there were people who were fighting for you before you were even in existence. So that what we have today could be. And the responsibility is on us as a young people here to continue that. Are the young people of these two generations all right? Yeah, they are. They're more confident, vocal, and connected in ways that their predecessors could not have even imagined. And that brings me to my final point with you today. What can we do? And I want you to take a look at this prompt, like keep it on the screen for a couple of seconds. And it says, what's one course of action you could take after our time together to become better allies to disabled youth, Gen Z and Gen Alpha? Take a time to think about that, write about it. If you have a notepad or you have a screen in front of you, um, just take some time to think about that. Because that's something we could all do to support our young people today. And I'm gonna go to our last slide. I'll put this back up on the screen, but I want to give you some ideas in case you feel a little stuck. Of course, I'm gonna say listen to them because I've harped on that, but listen to them, like truly, truly listen to them of what they have to say. I work with the young people, my activism work. They are incredible in the way that they see things, the way they talk about things, the ideas that they have, the richness in ideas, amazing. Get comfortable with saying the word disabled and disability. As you see here in my presentation, I did not say euphemisms like differently able or handy capable. Those euphemisms are for you. They're not for me. Say the word is a hashtag campaign that really urges people to be comfortable with saying disabled and disability. That's what it is, and that's who we are. And there's no shame in proclaiming I am a disabled person. Being honest about the fact that we all have biases and prejudices, that we need to confront them and do better about. We all do. We all do. And it is our responsibility to be continuously learning and integrating those biases and prejudices. Learn more disability history and stories that aren't just what you were taught in your programs, if you were taught at all. There's so much information out there because we have these microcomputers, in our pockets, in our purses. Take the time to learn. And lastly, allies don't take up space. Remember that. I know I may ruffle some feathers here, but teachers, parents, your place in the movement is important, but your place should not overshadow actually disabled people, particularly if you yourself are not disabled. We need parents, teachers, and other folks in the work because you're able to reach people that we may not, but because they may listen to you before they listen to me. And there's power in that. But the friction come into place when allies don't realize that they don't always need to be in the front. They don't always have to be centered. Because again, if you're not disabled, then you are an outsider of this community, no matter how much energy you may give into it. And that's not to shame or to be critical. It's just to understand that lived experiences trumps anything that you may have read, may have seen. Lived experience matters each and every time. And we'll go back to this prompt in case somebody wants to capture it. And that, folks, concludes our time together. This is where you can find me making a good trouble in activism. My website, rampyourvoice.com, on Facebook, Ramp Your Voice, and then on Twitter and Instagram, Twitter at Ramp Your Voice at Valissa Thompson, and also Instagram at Valissa Thompson.